Hello and welcome back to the Sweat Simple podcast. I am so excited because today is a very juicy episode on one of the most common things I hear when it comes to losing fat. So before we dive in, I want you to raise your hand if you've ever said, well, if I just had enough willpower, I would hit my goals. Or maybe something like, I'm gonna lose the fat this month. I just need a little bit more willpower. Or maybe even, no, like my fat loss plan is working. I just need more willpower. Now, raise your hand again if that's worked for you. If you've been able to somehow muster up enough willpower to grit through every craving and reach your goals. I'm going to bet that I'm hearing crickets right now, and probably not very many of you raised your hand for the last one. I bet a lot of you raised your hand and resonated with the first one, but when it comes to that actually working, we're not seeing those results. And I want you to know that's normal, because here's the thing. Willpower is not actually a fat loss plan. In fact, it is a terrible method if you're actually trying to lose fat. You might realize that your willpower and your self-control are pretty high, but the second you get really busy or you feel emotional or stressed, all that willpower goes out the window. And that's actually normal. It's science. Stress and self-control are enemies in your brain. When you're feeling stressed, it's near impossible to access the logical part of your brain that controls the planning, the decision making, and you guessed it, your self-control. So, as I'm sure you could imagine, willpower isn't the best fat loss strategy for this reason. We can't really tell our brains, hey, even though you are really stressed out, you need to have self-control. You need to have willpower. It's frankly impossible, which is why it feels so difficult to stick to your fat loss goals during those really stressful and overwhelming weeks. And on top of that, many of us are under the impression that we have limited amounts of self-control. We think that we only have so much that we can give, and after a full day of passing on the cookies and making all these other quote-unquote good decisions in our personal life, our self-control is shot. That's what we think. We get into this mindset of, I'm tapped out for the day, I have no more self-control, so I'm gonna just do whatever. And when we think about it, we're not only using self-control when it comes to fitness and nutrition. We're also using self-control throughout many other small areas of our life. Maybe you have a boss that you really don't get along with, and you have to utilize self-control in order to bite your tongue when you're responding to them. Maybe you use self-control when you're frustrated with your kids and you don't want to start an argument with them. Like, there are lots of instances we're using self-control throughout the day. So when we go into it with the mindset of, I have limited self-control to give, it's going to feel normal that by the end of the day, when it comes time to make that healthy dinner, you feel like you have nothing left. But I want to hit you with some good news, because there's actually new research that shows we don't have limited amounts of self-control. It's actually how we view self-control that determines how much we have. And that's kind of wild, right? And also, like, how empowering, how cool to be in control of your own self-control. If you view yourself as only having, this certain amount of self-control each day, then you're going to keep hitting that wall. But on the flip side, if you know that you actually have unlimited amounts of self-control, which we do, you'll start to feel like you're still able to flex that muscle even at the end of the day. So you're really looking at two different instances here. If you think that your self-control is maxed, of course you're going to end the day being like, I'm tapped out, I can't make another good decision, and I'm just going to throw in the towel. My self-control is done. Versus if you see yourself as having unlimited self-control, when you get to the end of the day, you're able to say, you know what, I do still have some self-control to give here. I'm still going to make that good choice because I'm not tapped. I'm not at my breaking point. I have this unlimited amount of self-control. It's really how you're viewing it that the research has showed that allows you to be more or less successful in utilizing self-control. So we're not tapped. We don't have limited amounts. It's just how we're viewing the self-control in general. And I tell you that so that you can start viewing self-control differently, and as a result, have more of it to give. You won't be tapped when it comes to self-control by knowing and understanding that. You're actually going to have more self-control moving forward. Something else that the new research has shown that is fully in your control is that people who rank themselves as having a lot of self-control are actually the people who need to use it less. So again, it's not that we have different amounts of self-control and willpower. It's not that Debbie down the street has more willpower than you do. It's not that I, as a health and fitness coach, have more self-control and willpower than you do. It's that the people who are using self-control less are more successful in reaching their goals. So what does this mean? How do you use self-control and willpower less? If we know that just telling yourself you need to have more willpower isn't really a good health and fitness strategy, how do we create a better one? How do we create a strategy that has us needing to rely on willpower and self-control less? It's by setting up your environment in a way so that you really don't even have to use self-control to begin with. That is the fat loss strategy. Not relying on willpower to carry you through, but setting up your environment in a way so that you don't need to use the willpower to begin with. Now, this could look like a lot of different things. It could look like planning out your meals for the week so that you don't have to decide what you're eating in the moment, especially after those really long, demanding work days. It could be prepping protein so that, again, you're not using self-control to get yourself to cook that chicken after it's the last thing you want to do. You don't have to make that decision in the moment. It's already done for you. You could also not buy certain foods so that you're not faced with that decision every single night as to if you're having the ice cream or not. You don't even have the option. It's not in your house. These are all ways to better set up your environment. Set up your environment so that you're not making all those little decisions during the day and needing to use willpower for every single one, because that can be exhausting. And this is also really where having a sustainable fat loss plan comes into play. Does your fat loss plan have you cutting out all your favorite foods and drinks so that you're constantly having to use willpower to say no? Or are you losing fat in a sustainable way that allows you to actually eat foods you enjoy and you don't feel like things have to be off limits? In the first scenario, you're having to use willpower all the time because you're constantly having to tell yourself, no, I can't eat that food. No, that food is off limits. And in the second, you're maybe having to make some this or that decisions. Like, of course, fat loss requires sacrifice, but you're not having to use willpower and say no to yourself nearly as frequently as you are with a really restrictive diet. Now, I also need to bring up the importance of stress management here because, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, stress and self-control are enemies in the brain. And in order to not have this be a competing factor, we do need to lessen our stress to begin with. Now, if this is something you struggle with, if you are like, you know what, I don't think it's my restrictive diet, I don't think it's my environment, I actually think that stress is my biggest issue when it comes to willpower and self-control. I have a whole other episode that's all about stress and self-control, and I actually give you some really actionable tips to take in that episode. So if this is something you're struggling with, if you know that stress is when all your willpower and self-control go out the window, I would go listen to that episode. It's episode number 106, so it makes it really easy to search for in my podcast little playlist that I've got. Now, the last thing I want to remind you of is that at the end of the day, having willpower and having to use that willpower muscle is temporary discomfort. We want and naturally gravitate towards the immediate dopamine hit and the thing that feels easy and comfortable to us. It's probably going to be at first the drive-through, pouring that extra glass of wine, having the snack, just saying yes to the ice cream because that's easy. We don't have to sit in the discomfort of telling ourselves no or making a decision that might feel new to us. Having to use willpower is hard. It's uncomfortable. It's forcing us to change. And as humans, we're going to try to avoid that. We don't want change. We want status quo. That's why it feels so hard sometimes to actually start to build some of these healthy habits. But in these moments, I want you to think about if you're willing to sit in this temporary discomfort for long-term gain. Are you willing to be a little uncomfortable for a few moments, knowing that it's leading to long-term change? So willpower alone is not a great fat loss strategy, but there are lots of ways to set up your environment and lifestyle so that you don't have to use as much willpower going forward. Now, that is the fat loss strategy I want you to use in the future. So instead of telling me that you just need more willpower, instead of looking back at the last 6 months and saying, well, these 6 months are going to go different because I just need more willpower, I want you to ditch that strategy. I want you to take a few key things from this podcast and implement a new strategy moving forward. Are you going to start to view willpower differently? Are you going to better set up your environment? Is it time to create a more sustainable fat loss plan? How are you changing your strategy moving forward so that you're not relying on willpower and grit to get you through, but instead you're actually relying on the science and the psychology that I use in my one-on-one online coaching methods that are going to get you results? Because willpower, it's just not a strategy. It's not going to help you long term. Instead, it's time to create a really actionable approach that's actually going to get you closer to your goals these next 6 months. So once you develop that plan, I would love to hear from you. Shoot me a DM. Let me know what you're doing. Let me know how you're better setting up your environment because I really want to hear from you guys, and I want to hear the types of things that you're pulling out of this podcast and what's been really helpful. So that is all I've got for you. As always, I so appreciate you guys listening. If this episode was helpful, please consider sharing it with a friend who would also benefit from hearing this information. But in general, I so appreciate you guys being here, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.